Poetry in the 21st century has all the shapes. We've got printed shapes on the page in all their innumerable forms and conventions, sure, but we also have performance poetry. Overlapping with spoken word, blending into verse play, we have albums of poetry striding the hinterlands between conscious rap and the beat poets of the 50s. We have digital poems, readable code poems that scan for humans like fragmentary verse and to machines like eloquent instructions to make ASCII rain or generate infinite nonsense haiku. There are video games in verse now. Verse plays became verse films. What we can do with poetry seems to have no limits. Poetic language finding its way into everything: advertising, political campaigns, graffiti and t-shirt designs. So this series exists to ask, why poetry? Of all the art forms to bake into the world around us, why and how does poetry end up in the forms it does, and how do those forms work?
Now, I'm asking the question of a kind of poetry that is beginning to become one of the dominant means by which poets are getting their work out into the world, even more so in our age of isolation. I want to ask for this episode, why poetry film? So, I figured the best person to ask would be a poetry filmmaker. So I called the poet, creative writing and poetics lecturer Lucy English, and I asked her, what is poetry film?
Well, there's a million and one ways that we get our work out, but for some reason, not a lot has kind of been written or kind of said about poetry film as a format, despite it being one of the forms where, if anything, more of it is taken and more of it is borrowed by other art forms. Say art forms very loosely, because I also include advertising, which technically is an art form. Like the visual poetic and poetry film making is utilised as a very shorthand way of explaining and kind of creating quick narrative chunks. But nobody seems to talk about the origin. So my opening question is, what is poetry film?
What is poetry film? Poetry film is a short film that contains poetry, whether in the form of spoken or text, visual image and sound. It is a blending of those three elements in a short film. We can see that its origins go right back to the very first films that were ever made, sort of back in the late 19th century, which were actually like moving pieces of art. And poetry film has more in common with the sort of early birth of film than it does with a Hollywood blockbuster. Because in many cases, poetry film has not got a narrative, it's not got a story, it's not got characters. It is that blending of words and sound and image.
Oh, awesome. So really, you're looking at kind of like the origin, like the progenitors of art film. Are there any kind of practitioners that we could kind of look at for that really early stuff?
I'd say Man Ray.
Legendary.
And Maya Deren, working in the 1940s again, and also people working what we now call as avant-garde cinema. People like David Lynch, you could see that the sort of work that they produce has got a sort of visual aesthetic.
Those first films were true experiments. The parameters of what could be achieved on camera in terms of storytelling explored the fringes of the technology available at the time. Practitioners like Man Ray in the late 1920s explored light and shadow in the photographic medium with an abstract and graphic surrealism. For Man Ray, check out Le Retour à la Raison from 1924, and Anemic Cinema, which is a collaboration between Man Ray, Marcel Duchamp and Marc Algarret in 1925-1926. Maya Deren in the 1940s pushed the surrealism into narrative realms. Her study in choreography for camera was shot in 1945, and then the beautiful and surreal At Land was in 1944. Dream-like sequences of moving images that would go on to inspire the likes of David Lynch to create nightmarish hyper-surreality in short film projects, feature films and series, the greatest of which, in my humble opinion, is Twin Peaks. If you haven't seen it, please do check it out. For David Lynch, my favourites were Fictitious Aniston Commercial, which was in 67, An Absurd Encounter in Fear, which came out the same year, and then the much later Dream Number 7, which was in 2010. The reason I felt Lucy was the best person to pick the brain of on the topic of poetry film is that alongside her work in the poetry film community, she also created a mammoth project of meditative poetic film called The Book of Hours. I stumbled across this serendipitously when I was figuring out a way into the form, and I feel like it captures so much of what sets the form apart from other modes of playing poetically.
First thing, I really wanted to kind of quiz you on the Book of Hours. It was my gateway drug to poetry film, really, yeah.
I want to hear that. I made the drug, hey.
Because and the reason I say that is because it's structured in such a way that I wasn't aware at first when I stumbled across it that the work changed dependent on the time of day and the part of the year, because it literally was just something that I was like, oh, this looks cool, I'll stumble across it. And I had a look at what was going on for that day, and then write it down, and I think I put it in an essay or something. And then went back later on, I was like, this is a really, really cool website, looking for ideas. And I came and I was like, ooh, is it like a blog? The things update? And I'm just kind of figuring out how it works, and like, this is genius. So, as a concept, like, why the Book of Hours as a concept? Talk to me about how
the Book of Hours as a concept. I love medieval books of hours. Medieval books of hours are beautifully illustrated, exquisitely illustrated manuscripts that vaguely follow the Christian year and the Christian calendar, and are these juxtapositions of text and image. I quite like what's called ekphrastic poetry, like Blake's Songs of Innocence and Experience. I'm quite a visual person, and I sometimes, I like that combination of visual and poem. I also wanted to, most of the poetry films I've seen have been like single poems or maybe a collection of 3. There are a few people that have done big collections of poetry films, like one in Coventry about the Coventry Ring Road, Disappear Here.
Oh, yes. I think I know. I think I do remember it because I started searching.
He literally linked up poets with filmmakers, and they did 29 poems, poetry films about the Coventry Ring Road. Great. And I wanted to create a poetry film project that was like a book. And I was interested in the idea of it was sort of like an illustrated book. How am I going to do this? Is it going to be static? No, it's going to be online. Why not have something that replicates a calendar? So I'm very, very loosely using the format of a medieval book of hours. One of the sections of a medieval book of hours is called The Hours, which it follows the monks' prayers throughout the day. That in the original Christian religion, a bit like in Muslim religion, they had prayers throughout the day. In the Book of Hours, the medieval Book of Hours would have followed that, like morning prayers, mid-morning prayers, lunchtime prayers, afternoon prayers.
That's awesome.
So I wanted to do. It's not Book of Hours. The Book of Hours I have created is not religious. It doesn't follow a particular religion, but it is meditative.
Yeah.
And the other idea behind it was to create an online project that isn't just about dangling stuff in your face. Buy this.
Yeah.
or dancing cats or mice in hats. There was something that was actually a bit quieter, a bit meditative, a bit more reflective. Why not have the online world as being a reflective place?
That sounds great.
I mean, maybe this is timely now.
Yeah,
maybe we're staring at screens for 48 hours a day. that we want a bit of reflection. So the sort of ideas spinning around there was something about creating a book, about creating a series of reflective moments, and we're following a calendar year as well.
The Book of Hours was a massively collaborative project. I wanted to find out a bit more about the challenges of working across such vast spans of time and distance and with so many people.
One of the things that I play with and poke with is the definition of a text, and it was one of the first kind of digital projects outside of code poetry that I kind of explored, where like there was kind of no doubt, like it was absolutely categorical. I was like, oh, this is what they mean when they say this is a digital text. It does everything that a text in the traditional terms does. But it has that layer of kind of responsiveness and interactivity and layers to its like possible avenues of discovery that I kind of just fell in love with. Because for me, like there was this weird point between literature, art, visual art, and what I consider an art form as well, video games, where I think we're all kind of slowly kind of spiraling towards where you've got this level of kind of decision-making, interactivity and responsiveness as the art world is trying to be more interactive. Yeah. And then this poetry film project came along, and it was just like, boom, so it reacts to physical space and time in the reader's world. It kind of gives you a deeper, more metatextual understanding of not just the poem that you're hearing, but the visuals that you're experiencing while you're hearing the poem. And it was just like, okay, this is a cool thing. This is a very cool thing.
Really good to hear that. It was interesting. I mean, all creative projects start from a point of view of confusion and chaos. I did not have this all completely mapped out when I started working it. I mean, it's my PhD thesis, a creative PhD thesis, and even having you have to put in all these proposals about what you think your project is about, you start making it think, oh my god, what am I doing here? That for me, it was really interesting finding the films that sort of coincide with that sort of time of day and time of year. That there is something about the time of day and the time of year that I wanted to express with the poetry film. So May afternoon has got a sort of specific feeling that may be different to sort of January morning.
Yeah.
It's about finding that essence of the time of day.
Because it wasn't an overly didactic project as well. Like, I do feel like I'm maybe waxing lyrical on the praises, but I do think it's worth like pointing out the bits that really worked are often the bits that aren't the most bombastic ones. So the fact that the work wasn't didactic, it didn't try to tell you how to think and feel based on a particular stereotype of a given time and place. It was that capturing of a sensation of a moment of like, this is a set of time. I mean, even to the point where even if you had extended the kind of, or kind of the made more specific the parameters of the project and said that this was simply the Book of Hours in relation to a very specific and particular year, that would have made it just as, like, it would have, without changing any of the poems, it would have made it a different project. But do you know what I mean? So it was done in such a way and curated in such a way that, how many years is it down the line now? How many years has it been running?
It made 4 years. I was making it for 4 years.
4 years.
So I started in 2000. I started it in 2014. I finished it that's 5 years. I started the idea came to me at the Dunbar at Alistair Cook's screening in Dunbar. I was sort of formulating the idea for the project there. And I made a pre-project poetry film with Mark Nees, which is called Perseads. I just wanted to experiment what the collaborative process was like, and that one is now part of the actual project. But it was made first. It was made second. So yeah, it took a long time. Another reason why it took a long time is I've got 27 collaborators. I mean, how mad could this possibly be? And also, this is very much a social media project, because I literally put a call out on Facebook and said, look, I'm creating a poetry film project. come on board, and to see who responded to that. So I've got people from Australia, I've got Jutta Pryor from Australia, I've got Mary Craven from Australia. And gradually, as the project grew, the other thing I found out that actually if you start sharing something in its early stages, rather than waiting till it's all finished and then online, I was actually showing it as it was progressing, that people thought, oh, this is interesting, I'd like to be part of this. So that's how my collaborators came forward.
That's awesome. That's a really innovative approach as well. There's something particular in our communities that creating kind of large-scale social projects based on kind of crowd participation, inviting that crowd participation, something we do really, really well. And I'm quite proud of us. Quite proud of us, poets and filmmakers and artists in this time. Coming together is something we're pretty good at doing.
And also this, I have to stress this was an unfunded project because of its experimental nature, because it was part of the PhD. I couldn't get any external funding for it. So it was a project where people were thinking, that's a nice thing to try. So, and I think having lots of collaborators means that they're proud of it too, because they've also created something out of nothing. And we, in terms of ownership, we co-own it, so they are free to show the films that they have made in collaboration with me wherever they want. It's part of their body of work too.
That's a really cool way of putting it. That's a really cool way of thinking about it as well. So kind of on a little bit more on the detail of the book out, so what kind of elements of like the devotional nature of the original religious concept did you try to bring into the digital book about us? Because there are, like you've mentioned before, like themes of kind of contemplation, themes of awareness of time and presence in the poems that I have a lot of love for. And I just wondered whether that was something that was deliberate, or whether it's poets and filmmakers riffing off what they'd seen of each other's work, or something that you led within the curatorial and creation process.
The overall feeling I wanted from the films was one of reflection, of some sort of moment of reflection. And what seemed to come out, quite a lot of the films were written in what's called the Welsh Marches, up in the borderline between Wales and England, which is sort of liminal piece of land. And I became very aware when I was staying there of the sort of the urban debris that it's, you cannot get away from urban life.
A pair of pink underpants. A flock of sparrows, always loud. A thrush's nest with 4 sea blue eggs. Walker's cheese and onion crisp packets too.
And that film, Things I Found in the Hedge, is very much about that. We may think we're in deepest rural England, but actually plastic is everywhere. And there was something about that. That wasn't an intention. That was something that came out in the making of the project. The sort of reflection of being in the countryside and realising you are an urban person. And how do you read it? How do you respond to it? There's another film in the collection about leaving the pub and walking home, and all of a sudden you're in pitch darkness.
It's dark. There are no stars. I could go back, bleep for a lift or light, but I don't want to be a stupid townie. So I step out, my hands straight in front of me. Perhaps I can see shapes. Yes, I can see the line of a hedge against the black. Stop. Remember something about how long it takes for eyes to adjust.
It's like, silly towny me, I forgot to bring my torch. And it's like sort of navigating that natural world, being an urban creature. There's something that definitely comes out in that.
So that sense of self-awareness, but also a person out of place, that was something that was you kind of wrote in, and then the artists, the visual artists who were making the film side of things, they responded to in the backwards and forwards.
Yes. I mean, the way that we created the films was different with each collaborator, just to make it even more complicated. I couldn't make this one more complicated. What I didn't want to do was to write a poem and send it to the filmmaker and say, make a film of this poem. If there was any element of that, I gave the filmmaker a choice. Sort of like, you know, here's 6 poems, which one could you respond to?
Oh, okay. So,
or we started with just an idea or sound. I mean, with Mark Nees, he starts with soundscapes. He sent me a whole set of soundscapes. And it was like, you know, write a poem responding to 1 or 2 of these. Just literally sounds.
That's amazing. So
that's a great way to go. That's a great way to collaborate, to do that back to front way.
Yeah, because I was just thinking, I hadn't twigged that, of course, the collaborative process is two-way.
It's two-way.
And the art that can be created, the work that can be created via an inversion of that process is something that I hadn't considered. So that was that key to that process as well then. So when you were developing, because like you said, you had 27 different collaborators, so you effectively had 27 different ways of collaborating. So which, okay, in that case then, what was some of your favourite methods of kind of collaborating to kind of create finished work? Because I mean, I know you talked to us about...
Using the soundscapes was wonderful. I mean, Mark Nees, I mean, honestly, he sent me this soundtrack. It sounded like things falling out of a cupboard. And it was sort of like, what the fuck am I doing with that? I think... poets are, I'm a poet. Poets are control freaks. And actually, it's really good to get away from that control. And it's to get a prompt that's coming from something else, not from my own control, I thought was really interesting. There were also colours. Somebody sent me a sort of spectrum of colours and to respond to that. Sometimes people sending me static images.
So
that film, The River Girl, she actually sent me some sort of short clips of moving images about a girl walking along a river, and that generated that particular poem.
So your process was strongly ekphrastic then. Were you asking them particularly to play with aspects of the verse as it was on the page or as it is in performance within their work? Because a lot, if not all of the ones that I looked at, including the 3 that we chose to look at, all of them have this very strong connection with the poetic as performed or as read in every term of the term, every definition of the term reading, and the visual poetic, the things you were seeing on screen, whether it's a cut at a particular line break, whether it's action and movement on emphasis. Like, so how did that come about? Because I've never met filmmakers who naturally would understand the nature of doing that. Is that something that you guided or something that you kind of came to over time?
That's interesting, isn't it? What I have certainly learned from doing this is that filmmakers have got a visual language. that you create a film and you are not just sticking images to illustrate the poem. That's, I think, let's get away from that idea that a poetry film is an illustration of the poem. Yeah. It isn't. It's another layer that may that actually may give a different narrative. An example of that is the one's called Daisy Chain, and the poem is about somebody making a daisy chain. And Eduardo Jagu in Sweden did these images of a sort of frozen landscape. And it became a real sort of contrast between what we think of in the winter. It's sort of like, do we think about summer in the winter? So it's quite interesting to see their interpretation of a poem. What I didn't really do, I mean, talking about poetry film, there's different ways of creating poetry film. You can do this very much, it's like moving text on screen, and it's quite sort of abstract. That's very much about, words, sort of flashing words. didn't choose that simply because they're not my preferred style of poetry film. I wanted to create something that had a sort of visual aesthetic.
Yeah.
That was sort of beautiful, really. And even the ones where there were words, like Things I Found in the Hedge by Catherine Darnell, that is absolutely beautiful, even though it is moving calligraphy.
Yeah.
In order to kind of understand a little bit more of what visual poetic meant, we picked 3 films from the project to analyse 3 different approaches filmmakers took to bringing the poems to life visually.
We could talk about What Is Love first, couldn't we? Que es el amor?
It is an absolutely beautiful film. Like, it's I shouldn't have favourites, but it is one of my favourites.
Everybody loves that.
¿Qué es el amor? Yo creo que es una tormenta. Una pareja atraviesa un parque para guarecerse bajo un árbol. Él la vio en el museo. Llevaba un vestido de flores.
Of that one. Eduardo Yagu is a Spanish poetry filmmaker, lives in Sweden, and he's very much working in the European tradition of filmmaking. And what I love about his films is he storyboards them.
¿Qué es el amor? Yo creo que es una casa nueva. Se apilan las cosas a toda velocidad en las habitaciones. ¿Cómo puede tener tantos vestidos, zapatos, cacharros de cocina?
I mean, he actually creates, with his poetry films, he actually creates these little narratives. What's interesting about What Is Love is there are actually 2 versions of it. There's an English version and a Spanish version. This one is the Spanish version. And he has turned it into this sort of epic drama about an old man mourning his dead wife. And that's not the poem. I wrote a poem about somebody meets somebody and then they get married and then their life fills up with stuff and then they're old, It's like, and he's got this wonderful old guy, I think it's his dad, just sitting there looking mournful and holding her gloves. It's completely heartbreaking. And it's like he's created this, I mean, it's only 3 minutes long. It feels like watching Andrei Rublev, doesn't it? It's such an emotional journey. It's such an emotional journey. I think he did an absolutely stunning job with that one.
Silencio. Escucha el mirlo. ¿Cuál era la canción? ¿Se acuerdan de la tormenta y del árbol?
And when it came back to me, it was like, oh my God.
¿Cuál era la canción?
What have you done? This is amazing. I sent him the poem. I sent him a selection of poems. He chose that one. He translated it into Spanish because he wanted to understand it. And then he created the film with the Spanish translation.
Okay, so when you send these poems, there's something I forgot to ask earlier. Are you doing this via text? Are you doing this via recording? How are you sending that initial text to kind of spark your part of the kind of the collaboration process?
Varied in different cases. In this case, I just sent him the text, and for this one, he wanted to make a Spanish voiced poem. Mm-hmm. So I thought the best way to do that was for me to send him just the text in English, and then he could have it translated. So the text that is spoken is the Spanish translation of the poem. So there are lots of things going back to what does this mean, and what does that mean? Because obviously, poetry in translation, there are certain things that you can't translate.
Mm. So he led entirely, and it created this kind of recontextualized a thing that is now other, because it's neither just the visual, it's not your poem, it's this other thing now. It's this third creation.
Yeah, it's like a third creation. It's like a third. And that is a beauty of collaboration. Really, it isn't just. It is a blending of two people's artistic sort of visions, but it's also then something else happens, and it becomes itself. That's interesting, isn't it?
That's very, very cool. Okay, so things I found in the hedge. So that one did that is much more kind of visually textual. I believe it's the one with text on screen, right?
That's got text on screen. This is Catherine Darnell, and she says she's basically a calligrapher.
A spider's web pearled with dew. Hawthorn blossom. A pair of pink underpants. A flock of sparrows, always loud. A thrush's nest.
She's come to poetry film through creating animated calligraphy. So all that film that she's created that is hand drawn.
Oh wow!
So it's quite a beautiful sort of slow process.
A white butterfly on a nettle bloom. A dead fledgling wren, I tucked it in the leaves. Meadow sweet and the smell of a fox by the drain. A green beetle with an iridescent sheen.
She says about it, the film uses animated handwritten calligraphy by the filmmaker, as well as vintage natural history illustrations to create an animation that manages to be both traditional and contemporary. The lines revolve in regular arcs to convey a sense of time and seasons passing. At the same time, translucent layers of words dance through the films, much like random impressions might move through our thoughts.
A Kit Kat wrapper and a dropped Mars bar turned white after a night of frost. The skeletons of hogweed.
Ooh, I like that. I like that a lot.
So she again has taken the text of the poem and found a sort of like this calligraphy interpretation of it, and it's a stunningly beautiful film, and it's quite what's the word? It's quite mesmerising, isn't it?
Yeah, it's incredibly meditative.
And it's and what's interesting about that yes, she is sort of illustrating the lines of the poem, the words of the poem, but it's not complete. There is that feeling about, you are watching a very beautiful animation.
So in terms of working with that poem, so the poem is ostensibly a Liszt poem. So the poem that you sent to her is ostensibly a Liszt poem. The things that are kind of beautiful about Liszt poems, but also can sometimes be terrifying to work with, is you've got such concrete sets of images that the orders at which those images appear are like fine. It's like a fine-tooth comb. Do you know what I mean? Like you have to kind of really pry them apart if you're going to play in any way with kind of like timing and form. So I can imagine that collaborative process, that way of stepping back entirely and creating visual that was much more based on that kind of almost that other aspect, like visual lines, creating a visual landscape combined with other human illustrated landscapes. It's almost like it's almost like looking at the poem from the other side. So instead of attempting to kind of go in and kind of pick apart those images, just let the images stand alone.
Of all the collaborators that I worked with, she's the one really that, I mean, if you look at the original books of ours, which were text, and they have these wonderful pictures in the margins, and I think she's very much taken inspiration from that. What she's done with this film, she's created the illustrations in the margins, because as you say, the text of that one is quite specific and quite detailed, and it's a bit of a risk sending her that, because how can you illustrate something that's already illustrative in the poem? But she's really sort of gone outside that, and she's followed I like the way she's followed the seasons in the poem with the colours. I think that's quite a skillful thing to do, and I certainly think that I'm really, really pleased that I collaborated with her because of that link to the original texts of the Book of Hours, which is calligraphy. I mean, if you look at a medieval manuscript, they've got a prayer in the middle, or a quote from the Bible, and all around the edge are sort of little illustrations of people digging digging fields, or sort of having sex or something, they're wonderfully profane illustrations in these sacred texts, and I think she's really got the feeling of that.
And I loved it. I absolutely loved it. And I think that there's something else that was kind of quite beautiful in the utilisation, because I thought the images at first, the landscape images were also her hand drawing, or maybe a combination of her hand drawing and archival stuff. But I love the idea in archival stuff that we've gone from mankind putting a fingerprint on the countryside has gone from these kind of very detailed kind of captures in these drawings to just leaving stuff in hedges now. It's a level of the interaction has degraded to that degree.
What is a tampon doing in a hedge? Oh my God! Yeah. I mean, all the things in that poem are things I found in a hedge. This sort of debris of mankind is insidious, isn't it?
Yeah.
The stuff that gets washed up on beaches, like remote islands have got trainers being washed up. It's amazing, isn't it? You see those pictures there that go round and round on Facebook. Deserted island, and it's it's all full of Coke cans and old trainers.
Gosh, yeah, we do get everywhere. We do get everywhere. So the last film that we wanted to play with is The Sundial.
With Lucia Sellers. This was an interesting collaboration, because what she's basically done, and it was a bit of a sort of shock moment, she literally tore the poem apart, and she's just used lines from the poem. That the actual text of the poem has got some of the lines that are there in the film, but it's not the complete poem.
Because I want to be alone. To me today. Because I want to be alone. Today there is no sun. Do not talk to me today. Because I want to be alone. There's not a single shadow on the sundial. Do not talk to me today. Because today there is no sun. I am not sad. Today there is no sun.
Okay.
So that's another. I mean, for a poet to have their poem ripped to shreds, it's like, oh my God, you ripped my poem to shreds! Help! But I think she's done a beautiful job with that, and the repeated voice and that sort of bell-like sound. Again, it's an extremely meditative piece of work. That film. And the hand in the sort of stocking, blocking out the sun. I think what she's done there is she's almost found the essence of the poem.
There's not a single shadow on the sundial. The cherry tree has bark like the cherry tree, and my thoughts are the words like parchment, and my thoughts are the words written in ancient script. Don't forget to breathe.
Yeah.
And maybe that's something to say to poets when they're interpreting poems, is you don't have to use the whole poem. You could just take the essence of it. You could take a few words.
So that relinquishing of control, how did that feel? Because often in the collaborative process, it is the most difficult thing for a lot of people.
When I learned that's what I had to do, it made the process a lot easier. I read an interesting article written by the poet Philip Gross, who does a lot of collaboration in lots of different art forms, and he said something about you've got to give up control, you've got to relinquish that control, otherwise you become dictator rather than a collaborator.
Yeah, I understand.
And I do know, I have heard of poetry film projects that have been undermined because the poet said, "Oh no, I don't want you to do it like that. I want you to do it like this." You know, that as a poet, I thought my filmmaker knows more about film than I do.
Yeah,
I'm going to trust their judgment, which is, it's trust, isn't it? It's trusting.
I'm trying to imagine getting to that point where I feel like I could, because I've worked collaboratively in theatrics. I've worked collaboratively in terms of I've done 1 or 2 poetry films myself. The biggest project I had did actually have a very large group of collaborators, and the filmmaker I was working with was great. It was the first kind of professional-ish film that I made. But there was always this kind of the ability to defer to the poem.
Yeah.
And I think that's the thing that kind of carried through. Not so much the poem in terms of the text. Like, I talk about this with poems. I talk about this with poets quite often, that like what we mean when we say the poem, because we don't always mean like the literal words on the page in that order.
Yeah.
so like deferring to the poem in that sense meant that like you could kind of you created this thing that was a subset of feelings and images and sounds, or depending on which layer of the poem you wanted to kind of analyse. And then given what you were doing with the filmmaking, the decisions could be kind of like, you could feed back into that, well, would this work for the sound of the poem? Or no, because that soundtrack would be too loud over this middle section, which is quite quiet and written to be quite quiet. So, yeah, it's been an interesting...
It's an interesting thing to learn. I mean, the very first filmmaker I worked with on Book of Hours was Mark News. And I thought, you know, he is a very experienced poetry filmmaker. I'm literally going to trust what he comes up with. And rather than me telling him what to do. And that was an interesting experience, because the films that he made were, if I had made a poetry film out of those poems, it would have been nothing like what he came up with. And it was a really interesting insight into, if you trust someone else's artistic judgment, you're going to have sort of very, very different outcomes. That I know poets do make their own poetry films, and Helen Dewberry is very keen on teaching poets how to use technology to create a poetry film on a Mac. But I just wonder if you would get that, almost like that skewed sort of insight that you get when you work with another person.
I think there's a lot to be said about the freeing process of collaboration. I think
on both sides. It has to be on both sides. It has to be on both sides. You can't have somebody dictating it, or it wouldn't work.
Okay, so what's next then in terms of poetry filmmaking?
Well, at the moment, I'm working on a triptych I've got 2 American collaborators called Pamela Falkenberg and Jack Cochran, who made 2 films for the Book of Hours, one called The Shadow, one called The Names of Trees. They're very into, they're the borderline between poetry film and short experimental film. Okay. The film that they made for the Book of Hours, called The Names of Trees, has been screened at more than 30 film festivals. It's visually, it's very, very mysterious and experimental. They did this sort of infrared sort of technique. Sorry, I'm not a techie person, but it's like sort of really crazy sort of dream sequences. So I'm working on a triptych project with them about the environment, basically. They gave me some images about 8 months ago, and I started writing something, and I didn't like it. I wrote something else, I didn't like it. And then just very, very recently, with all this crisis, I've come up with 3 poems to respond to their images, and it's something about breathing pure air, which seems to be quite sort of relevant.
Yeah, you could say that.
And the images that they've got are they do a lot of images in the American landscape, and they've been working in the Texas Permian Basin, which is where the big oil fields are, and it's the visuals are the visuals of this beautiful American landscape, and then the just sort of trash that gets that happens when stuff gets taken over by sort of massive multi-industries. So I mean, they're very, very stunning visual images. So it's going to be really interesting to see what comes together with that. So it's going to be a triptych, like 3 related films, and I don't quite know how we're going to screen that. Whether we're going to do that as an individual or screen them all at the same time. That would be quite interesting.
That would be amazing.
That would be amazing. That would be amazing. And they're very into thinking about things like that, and sort of like different places to screen poetry films.
Poetry film is a truly 21st century format with roots in the genesis of modern cinema. Its power to transcend and transform the choices made by the poet on the page and utilize the linguistic aspects of poetic language alongside cinema's particular visual poetic to create something entirely new and entirely now makes it an exciting form that anyone with a bit of tech can explore. So bring on poetry film. You can pick up a camera or cut together existing footage to open your poems up. The community is small and vital and vibrant, so the more makers in the form, the more opportunities for growth and experimentation we will see. A massive thank you to Lucy for talking to me and inspiring me to explore the form further. You can check out the Book of Hours in all its glory at thebookofhours.org, and I look forward to seeing the creations you come up with. Verse First has a growing list of interesting performance film and poetry film on its YouTube playlist. If you feel inspired or have film ready out in the world, send me a link on contact@versefirst.org and I'll gather the highlights into the playlist Visual Verse on our YouTube page. You can also check out the Why Poetry blog on www.versefirst.org for more resources I gathered in making this doc. This project, as well as all the other projects at Verse First, would not be possible without the support of our patrons. And a special shout out going to Casey Bailey, Emma Louise Thompson, Jessica Spaz, Asuna Afshan, and Vanita Earl. If you love what we do, in our explorations of poetry and the poetic, you can support us on Patreon for extra goodies and access to our Discord server, where our growing community come to talk about our shared love of doing cool things with words. I've been Think Right Fly. This has been Why Poetry, and we'll talk soon.